Holy Week is a time we as Christians give special attention in reflecting on the suffering of Christ. Today, our guests will illuminate the suffering of Christ as they share from their personal and professional experience as special educators. Please stay tuned. Welcome to the show. I'm Karen Crozier, and today I'm joined with David Jones, who's Practicum Coordinator in Special Education at Fresno Pacific University. Welcome to the show, David.
My pleasure, thank you.
As well as Lisa Keith, who is Assistant Professor in Special Education at Fresno Pacific University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So let's get into what brought you into special education. We could begin with you, Lisa. What brought you into that field?
Actually, I was getting my multiple subject teaching credential and had to do some observation hours. I acted as a surrogate parent in special education for a local district, and I really saw that people weren't saying very positive things about special education students, and I really felt like someone needed to stand up and speak out for them, and it was that experience that had me go through and get my special education credential.
Mm-hmm. So it was the exclusion.
Absolutely. Oh. You'd go to meetings and they would tell you that a student couldn't do this or couldn't do that or was doing this wrong or was behaving poorly, and they never said anything positive. And I wanted to change that.
Yes. And David?
You know, I had a more backwards tale. I grew up around very few people who fell into the category of special needs. Went to a private church-based school for about 13 years. Met with very few people who were served in special education settings. It was after I obtained my psychology degree that I started working with adults with exceptionalities. And then kind of backwards fell back into supporting teachers who were pursuing credentials to teach younger individuals with special needs.
So, wow, why do you call it backwards?
You know, most frequently people go the other way. They start working with younger people with special needs. And then ultimately graduate with the students to support them as adults.
And Lisa, you're nodding. Is that part of your experience as well?
Well, in that I started the traditional way. I started with kindergartners and then have moved up all the way through high school in my career. So he did it the inverse way, yeah.
So, all right. And when we look at the various research that is being done on, David, using your word exceptionalities, you know, as opposed to quote unquote special needs. So helping to reframe, and as Lisa, you were sharing the deficits, but looking at the positive. Share about some of the research that you've been conducting on students with exceptionality.
I would love to. Actually, recently my research partner, Dr. Julianne Lane, and I have studied characteristics of Christian schools across the United States that are currently serving students with exceptionalities. Quite frequently, schools rely on funding from federal sources or just outside funding of some sort, and a lot of private and parochial schools don't receive that kind of support, which leaves them a little bit shorthanded for resources to help these students. Now we know that it still happens. Private and parochial schools have a very safe environment that's maybe not typical of a public school, at least as an average. So we know that it does happen, but we want to understand more about what this service looks like, what kind of resources are available, what kind of training is prevalent. So we recently conducted a survey of over 250 schools across the United States, which is a pretty significant number, really one of the first of its kind to be so wide-reaching. And what we found is that, yes, there are a number of Christian private parochial schools that are willing and hopeful to serve students with exceptionalities, but they are struggling with the lack of resources. One of the things that they desperately need is they need help supporting the educators that are directly working with the students with exceptionalities.
Thank you. And Lisa, your research.
My research began in the mental health field as well. My master's is in counseling psychology, and my doctorate is in organizational psychology. So I looked at originally how people disclose mental illness in the workplace. My new research is in the same field, working with children with emotional or behavioral disorders, but looking more at how teacher disposition affects student achievement and how does it affect student behavior and the number of referrals, expulsions, suspensions, and that sort of thing. And what I'm finding is that teacher disposition has a huge effect on students' ability to be successful in the classroom.
And as we talk about your research findings on your very timely projects, what does some of your findings say or can be said to our local churches and denominations in ministering and serving children and families with exceptionalities? Lisa, let's begin with you with the mental health component. What are you finding that can speak directly to what churches need to hear and know?
They need to understand that it is an illness, that it's not a character flaw or a parenting flaw, that it's a biologic illness that can be treated with talk therapy, with medications, with other coping strategies, and that families need support. They need community to come alongside them and help them to deal with some of those issues when you have a child with emotional or behavioral disorder.
And can you explain for the viewing audience, what do you mean by talk therapy?
So it would be going to what traditionally is called psychotherapy. So it could be individual one-on-one with a licensed clinical social worker, a marriage family therapist, a licensed psychologist, for example, a psychiatrist. Could be group therapy where you have families together or just the child with other children together with a therapist.
So it's a way of trying to move away from the stigma of psychotherapy?
Correct. Yeah, I think people think, if I go to a therapist, there's some negative connotation there. And really, everybody I talk to at one point or another have needed some support in their life, whether they talk to someone in the pastoral field or whether they talk to someone in the psychology field. Having that support there is tremendously helpful.
Thank you. And David, what do you think that the church needs to know from some of the findings that you have?
First, I have to echo the sentiments of Dr. Keith here. There still seems to be quite a bit of stigma around this idea, especially when it's not necessarily a medically based condition like an emotional disturbance. But in addition to that, churches continue to lag behind in service to adults and children with exceptionalities. And that really can't stand any longer. I've been overjoyed to see in my lifetime a huge surge in the number of churches that are exploring and starting their clumsy ways of serving these individuals, and I rejoice in all of those instances. But it certainly doesn't suffice. Even a number of families can't attend church on a regular basis because there's no support for their child in order to let the family do so.
One of the ways the churches can reach out is by getting training through something like mental health first aid, which is provided by Mental Health America at the Central Valley. And they do talk to clergy and teachers and other kinds of people in the community as to how to start that conversation. How do we even talk about this? I think that's important.
Yes, a great resource. And even when we look at, according to your research project, David, working with Christian institutions of schools and knowing that Christian schools are doing a better job than what our churches are doing, and there's a disconnect seemingly there. So how can you get the churches to talk to the schools?
Absolutely. You know, one of the things that we in the Special Education Division at Fresno Pacific University are proud to do to help local churches is that we've invited, and we will be hosting a nationally acclaimed organization, Johnny and Friends, in October to help churches understand this better. There's a number of things. Some of them just have to do with the idea of how to design a church. How do you design a church that it's welcoming to people who have difficulty maneuvering, because of physical impediments, or because of coordination skills? What do we do for families who have older children that need a quiet room? We have these rooms for breastfeeding children, for maybe very young infants, but what about the older children that need this quiet time?
And adult children as well.
Absolutely.
Right, so it's looking at the overall environment and accessibility in the ways that we structure our churches. We are being exclusive, and how can churches become more conscious of what that means and just being welcoming in the space? Exactly, I think that's crucial. And when we look at, as we discussed in the opening, the suffering of Christ, and Lisa, you spoke to as far as the suffering you was experiencing with the students, as far as the way that you heard that the ways they were being dismissed. What connections, other connections, do you see between suffering of Christ out of our faith tradition, as well as those who are suffering in our cultural context with their disability?
I think what you said was exactly spot on, that children with disabilities or exceptionalities feel unloved, unwanted, not valued, and what we can do is to acknowledge that although they have a weakness in a certain area, there's so much that they have to contribute. Now, suffering can be physical impaired caused, or it can be spiritual. And I think it's that spiritual lacking, that lack of support from our faith community that's causing the suffering.
Yes. Mm-hmm. After the break, we will hear from your perspective, Davey. At this time, we will take a break.
For over 25 years, KNXT has been serving the people of the San Joaquin Valley with good family television that's just not available anywhere else. It's important for you, the viewer, to help support this valuable tool of ministry. KNXT needs to continue to grow and bring you important programming about your faith. But sometimes it's hard to stop and find the time. Make it easy. Go to knxt.tv and find out how easy it is to support your Catholic television station, KNXT TV.
Welcome back to the show. I'm joined today by David Jones, Practicum Coordinator in Special Ed at Fresno Pacific University, and Lisa Keith, Assistant Professor in Special Education. Before the break, Lisa was speaking to the reality of the suffering of Christ and the ways that our sisters and brothers suffer who have a disability or exceptionality. David, can you please share what is your connection and what parallels do you see?
Another angle of this idea of suffering, Dr. Kay Redfield Jamison talks about her own disability, bipolar disorder, and one of the examples of her personal suffering in a professional field is that quite frequently people discount her, chalk things up to her disability, and don't give her credit for either her failings or her own successes. And, I think commonly among individuals with exceptionalities, that still remains, that still proves true, is that we have a hard time giving them credit for their own failures or successes, and we constantly find this need in ourselves to chalk it up to other things around them, like they couldn't have done it without all this additional support that they got, or they're acting this way because of their disability. So it's almost like their disability becomes a Siamese twin, and then of course all the attention shifts off of the individual with the exceptionality to the exceptionality. It becomes the phantom stepbrother, if you will.
Say more about that phantom stepbrother.
Oh, we could talk for a long time.
Yes,
in fact,
that's
quite
a concept.
a number of books. Throughout the Gospels, there's this thin thread following the ministry of Jesus, where the religious leaders of the day would constantly try to chalk things up to him being crazy or out of his mind.
Sorry, I hate that word.
Yeah, it's a bad word. Absolutely a terrible word. But they wanted to discount him for any possible reason, and they would rely on these really superficial things that weren't the core of who Christ was for the sake of discounting what he was preaching.
Right. Okay, so it becomes trying to bring about somebody, let me see if I can get your concept, bring about somebody else without looking at the core of who that person is.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So, for example, one of the things I had to do when I went through the interview process at Fresno Pacific was I had to talk about my faith walk. And part of my faith walk has been directly influenced by my own mental illness, which I have bipolar disorder. And I had to share that part of my being able to survive and live with a chronic illness has been my faith. But I think a lot of people look at my behavior here or there and they'll say, oh, well, she was only able to go to school and work and have children because she was manic, or she acted this way because she was on medication, or, they never just think, this is, her ability to overcome all odds and be successful.
And that idea of the medication being given the credit is absolutely the worst one, that people can only function well when it's, the medication. If the person succeeds, well, thank goodness they had their medication.
Wow, that is a pretty enlightening moment there, because this takes me back when I was a second grade teacher, and I was a second grade teacher in West Fresno, and one of my second graders, African American male, was on Ritalin. That's for hyperactivity, right?
Attention, yeah.
And I got upset because I said, we can't keep drugging up our babies like this. And so, well, he's better. Well, there's other ways that we can respond in a comprehensive educational plan to support our students in this process. So was I wrong?
I think it depends. It's an individualized choice,
Yeah,
For me, I have a serious mental illness and I need to take medication, and I will take it every day for the rest of my life. Now, it took me 10 years to come up with the appropriate mix of medications until I was able to be stabilized. I've been on the same medications, for example, for almost 9 years, and I was able to complete a master's degree and a doctorate degree. So I would say that I'm not going to change anything because it's working for me. But I think every family has to choose for themselves what's going to work.
And if I'm hearing David correctly, it's giving all the credit to the medication.
Correct.
It's a comprehensive thing, and we got to look at the various supports that is necessary in caring for the whole human.
Yes.
and
It's not giving me an edge up, it's giving me equal footing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so when we talk about the various aspects and experiences of those of us with exceptionalities, what do you consider to be the most pressing challenges that you would like the church to really listen to and people of faith to listen to in this conversation? David, let's begin with you.
The transition to adulthood within special education, whether we're talking about schools or whether we're talking about completely out of an educational setting, there's a tremendous need that we've hardly ever experienced before to understand that families need to be supported in helping their children with exceptionalities transition to adulthood. So many decades ago, we never had this problem because these individuals were shut up in institutions, died from neglect, were just ignored, never seen. Now we have individuals with severe autism living into their 70s. Right here in Fresno, within 2 blocks of this very studio, we have adults living together who have exceptionalities, and we need to understand what kind of help they need. It would be fantastic to see the church, to see Christians as individuals taking the charge of how to help these adults succeed. Their families have fought for decades to get them basic services in public schools, to get basic help training these individuals how to feed and clothe themselves. But what happens when they go into assisted living themselves? These parents are no longer there on the scene. Who will advocate for them? It has to be more than just making sure that they're fed and clothed and they make their doctor's appointments. There has to be a charge for making these adult lives meaningful. And
I think you hit on an important point there, That these lives are meaningful, and that these people, children, adults, what have you, have some contribution to make to our community. There's value in their lives inherently, and it's not just what we can do for them, but it's also how can we interact with them and what can they give to us. It has to be community. It has to be people working together to find, you know, what does it mean to be a Christian in this community?
There's a significant impetus to address special needs through early intervention. It's tremendous effort, tremendous resources pushed into at the very early ages of identification. What can we do to support families to get these children up to functional levels? But what happens when we don't fix, quote unquote, the issues? What happens when they, at age 25, still need help getting into their sweaters, need help tying their shoes, need help being fed? These are hard things to handle, especially for so long. So what are we doing for that effort?
And what are we doing in a Christian way? I think that's the important point, is that it's not just something that society is required to do. Okay, we'll provide this apartment complex and we'll keep them safe. It needs to be more enriched than that. You know, they deserve to have self-determination. They deserve to make choices. They deserve to give what they can give. And I think that's where we come in as a faith community.
So explain more, Lisa, what you see as the Christian way. How can that really be done? Or where do you see it being done, as starting from yourself? How does your faith speak to these particular challenges that have been raised by both you and David?
So one of the things that I do is, in my classwork, I teach how to build relationships with children. You have a very angry child, for example. They're angry for a reason. They're not acting out because they got up in the morning and they said, okay, how am I going to ruin Mrs. Smith's day? They have pain in their lives, and they're acting out of that pain. They're lonely, they're withdrawn, there's something wrong. So I teach our teacher candidates how to investigate, how to build relationship, how to talk and find out, okay, so why is this child tantruming? Why is this child eloping from the classroom? And what's going on? How can we communicate in such a way that we bring them into, constantly invite them into relationship?
So that becomes the focal point for you as Christians, that we are transcending the barriers that's keeping us separated.
Exactly.
Yeah, and having the skills to not be fearful of what they are experiencing in the external acting out of it, but how do we move beyond that? Am I hearing you correctly?
Exactly right. And Ron and Roxanne Clausen have done some tremendous work on Discipline That Restores, talking about restorative justice, but also in the classroom, restorative discipline. We don't want to just send the child out to the vice principal's office. We want to make sure that when they come back to our room, that we restore that relationship, that we build upon it, so that the next time that child has a difficulty or a challenge, we're there for them. We're not just sending them out again, you know.
And David, thank you. What do you think should be the specific focus of faith in addressing the challenges we've been discussing?
A point that Dr. Keith presented to us was that idea about relating with these individuals, not managing them, but actually genuinely relating with them. I think that's the easiest, most frequently overlooked aspect of this, is that these are individuals who can and want to interact with other people, may have needs for making that happen, but that's one of our strong suits. We have the master relator who came to earth and showed us how to move beyond the bounds of teaching and guiding disciples to relating to even children who maybe even shouldn't have been in the crowd that day, but taking that time to address them.
Yes, and as we look at who Jesus was as a great exemplar in crossing boundaries, crossing barriers, there's another individual, John Vanier, who is the founder of the Large Communities, who deals with who lives in community with the severely physically and mentally handicapped or disabled. But he points out to us in many ways is that when we as quote unquote able bodies are in communion with those who are perceived as disabled, that's when we find who we really are as humans and come to know what it means to be human and in community with each other. What are your thoughts in 30 seconds or less on Bange's point?
I think he's spot on, that when we see someone with what we perceive as a weakness, we are forced to look at our own weakness. And when we acknowledge that in ourselves and we can freely acknowledge that in the other person, then we become more human, like he said.
Thank you.
I completely concur. It's an absolutely transformative experience to work with individuals with exceptionalities, not necessarily transformative to the person who's receiving your assistance, but to the person who's giving it. Having worked with adults with disabilities and being on the process of hiring people to serve those individuals, we would quite often look for vocabulary that sounded like, I've been touched, or I've been changed, working with with people with exceptionalities in the past, and I want that opportunity again. You know, it's very much like the story of Peter's feet being washed. His wasn't the life change, it was Christ in giving that service to Peter.
And so that reminds us of, as you ended with Christ and how Christ gave, and how we as Christ's disciples give, we become in touch with who we are as we give to one another. And as we touch the lives of our own fragility to become human as God made us to be. Well, thank you for being on the show today. Thank you for watching. You can catch us online at knxt.tv or on Thursdays at 8 p.m. or Fridays at 1. Take care and God bless.